Hi, I'm Richard Chambers, President and CEO of the Institute of Internal Auditors, and welcome back to another on my Insights and Advice videos where I talk with internal audit leaders and thought leaders from around the world on issues impacting the internal audit profession. Joining me today is Mike Varney. Mike is a partner with Crowe. He's in the supply chain and risk group. Did I get that right, Mike?
Yep, that is correct, Richard.
Good, good. Well, thank you for joining us. Mike, your expertise is in risk and supply chain, and I would tell you that that's a great combination, both the supply chain and the risk that it presents. You know, extended supply chains, the taxing of extended supply chains has always been a risk that organizations were concerned about. But it would appear this pandemic is a perfect recipe for that risk coming to fruition. Wondering what you see in your role and with your responsibilities within your firm around supply chain risks that have evolved or emerged from this pandemic, and how you would assess that risk and what advice you might have about how it could be contained and managed.
If you think of most organizations, the goal of the supply chain was lean, efficient, and cost conscious. So what you saw end up happening is there was usually a very small, select, very targeted way this supply chain was organized to drive that efficiency and drive that leanness. Well, then an event like this pandemic shows up, and a lot of these supply chains were not ready to absorb that. So one of the things we've seen is it's kind of, organizations are kind of falling into three buckets. Those that quite candidly, clearly just were not prepared. So they've been caught very flat-footed and they're struggling to rebound from that. Then there's kind of this middle group that had plans in place, either had a disaster recovery or some sort of supply chain resiliency plan in place, but they hadn't really tested it. They hadn't gone out and validated, you know, if A happens, I need to call Richard because Richard's going to handle this piece, you know. So, and then some of what they found when they went to pull them off the shelf is, well, Richard's no longer at the company. So now who do I call? And then there's this third group that seemed to be fairly well prepared, but given the severity and widespread impact of this, they found they had some bumps and some lumps in their plan. So a lot of where we're getting calls from our clients is obviously in that kind of middle group, in the first group, and being very much focused on how do you get a plan in place that kind of drives visibility, awareness, and response when something, and then kind of the what do you do when it happens. And I think the other piece that's been very interesting about this is it's very industry agnostic. Like we can pick any type of industry, and their supply chains have been impacted by this. But what's been interesting about it is if you look take ventilators, for example, demand for ventilators went through the roof. You know, we needed to have them. And so getting production ramped up to meet that demand. You know, some organizations were just not positioned to meet that increased demand. So you've got kind of that end of the spectrum to where demand dramatically increases. Then you go to the other end of the spectrum where demand dramatically decreased. And the only example I can think of kind of off the cuff is high-end bags. You know, people's spend went through the floor. They didn't want to spend as much. So luxury items, you start to see a drop-off. So now you've got one end of the spectrum of how do I meet the demand? The other end of the spectrum, I've got all this supply and all this product. What do I do with it?
Yeah.
So being able to have a plan to be flexible becomes very critical.
So what role does internal audit play? How would you advise internal audit to engage around supply chain risks? And, you know, is there some specific piece of advice you'd give them as to how they could go about providing any assurance around it?
So I think there's probably the start is where I would suggest is don't be afraid to ask the question. I think sometimes as we go into the operational side of the business, we start to tread in water that we may not all have deep competency in. So don't be afraid to ask the question. And it could be questions around, do you have a disaster recovery plan? Or have you thought about a disruption? Like if this supplier can't meet this demand, what have you considered? So just start very I would say very simple, very kind of high level. And then the other kind of piece to it that we tend to ask is a lot of people to the point of extended supply chains. A lot of organizations will answer that first question of, oh yeah, I know these 5 suppliers. They're critical to us and we've got plans in place to address them. Well, what about their suppliers? Have you thought about that second and third tier? We usually refer to it as down chain supply chain.
Right.
Do you have visibility to that? And so just don't be afraid to ask those questions. And then I think if you get the answer back that yes, we've got a plan, we're in good shape, then go down the next path of, well, have you tested it? Is there validation? So I think it's focusing on those 2 high level areas initially is, do you have something in place? And what have you thought through in pulling that into place? And then have you done any validation within your plan to see that it's going to be operating effectively?
Mike, that's great advice for internal auditors out there who are in companies and organizations where supply chain risks are there and maybe haven't been top of mind for internal audit. So thank you for joining me today and for sharing your perspectives around that. We look forward maybe to having another conversation with you in the future. I'm Richard Chambers, President and CEO of the Institute of Internal Auditors, and thank you for joining us as well.
Thank you.